The sound of a woman's voice drifted across the prairie like morning mist over water, and Kyle Mercer pulled his horse to a sudden stop, certain he had imagined it because no one lived within 5 miles of his ranch boundary. The year was 1878, and Fort Benton, Montana Territory, wasn't exactly overflowing with settlers willing to brave the harsh winters and unpredictable summers, especially not women who sang while doing their chores as if they hadn't a care in the world. He sat there on his gelding, straining to hear past the wind rustling through the tall grass. And there it came again, a melody so pure and sweet it made his chest ache with loneliness he hadn't let himself feel in years. Kyle was 31 years old and had been running his cattle ranch alone for the better part of a decade, ever since his father passed from pneumonia and his mother followed 6 months later from what the doctor called a broken heart. He had grown accustomed to silence, to the lowing of cattle and the occasional conversation with his ranch hands, but nothing like this haunting tune that seemed to pull him forward against his better judgment. He urged his horse toward the sound, cresting a small hill that overlooked a valley he thought he knew well, only to find a sight that stopped him cold. A modest cabin sat nestled against a grove of cottonwood trees, smoke rising from its chimney, and in the yard stood a woman hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 posts. She wore a simple blue calico dress, her dark hair plaited down her back, and she hummed that melody while pinning a white sheet to the line, completely unaware she had an audience. Kyle felt like an intruder watching her, but he couldn't seem to make himself known or turn away. The tune she hummed was unfamiliar but beautiful, rising and falling with natural ease, and something about it resonated deep in his bones. The woman reached for another wet garment from her basket, still humming, and Kyle finally cleared his throat loud enough to be heard. She spun around so fast, she nearly knocked over her laundry basket, her hand flying to her chest in surprise. Even from this distance, Kyle could see her eyes were wide with alarm, and he immediately felt like a fool for startling her. "I am sorry, madam," he called out, raising one hand in what he hoped was a peaceful gesture. "I did not mean to frighten you. I was riding my property line and heard your song." The woman's posture remained tense, her eyes scanning him from his worn leather hat down to his dusty boots. "Your property line?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly across the space between them. "I was told this land was available for homesteading." Kyle urged his horse forward slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and unthreatening. As he drew closer, he could see she was young, probably in her mid-20s, with a face that was more interesting than conventionally pretty, marked by high cheekbones and eyes that held both wariness and determination. "That it is," he confirmed. "My ranch borders this section to the east and south. I am Kyle Mercer. I own the Broken M Ranch." "Julia Owens," she replied, relaxing slightly but keeping the laundry basket between them like a shield. "I filed my claim 3 weeks ago and just finished getting the cabin habitable." "I did not realize I had neighbors so close." "The nearest town is Fort Benton, about 7 miles north," Kyle said, dismounting but keeping hold of his horse's reins. "Might I ask what brings a woman alone to file a homestead claim? It is not exactly common." Julia's chin lifted, and he saw a flash of defiance in her eyes. "I am a widow, Mr. Mercer. My husband died 2 years ago in a mining accident in Colorado. I have been working as a seamstress and saving every penny to start fresh somewhere new. The Homestead Act does not require me to be a man to claim land, only to improve it and live on it for 5 years." Kyle felt appropriately chastened by her tone. "I meant no disrespect, Mrs. Owens. You are right, of course. I just worry about a woman alone out here. It can be dangerous, especially with winter coming in a few months." I appreciate your concern, but I assure you I can take care of myself, Julia said, though her voice had softened slightly. I grew up on a farm in Ohio. I know hard work. They stood there in awkward silence for a moment, Kyle searching for something to say that would not sound patronizing and Julia clearly waiting for him to leave. Finally, he gestured toward the laundry line. That melody you were humming, where did you learn it? Julia's expression shifted, surprise replacing wariness. My mother taught it to me. She said her grandmother brought it from Ireland. Why do you ask? It is beautiful, Kyle said honestly. I have not heard music in a long time. There is not much call for it when you live alone. Something in Julia's face softened then, and she offered him the first hint of a smile. Thank you. Singing helps pass the time during chores, makes them feel less tedious. Kyle wanted to keep the conversation going, to hear more of that voice and see that small smile widen, but he could tell Julia was still uncertain about him. Well, I should let you get back to your work, he said, stepping back toward his horse. If you need anything, my ranch house is about 5 miles east. Just follow the creek that runs behind your cabin. Any of my hands can point you in the right direction. That is kind of you, Mr. Mercer, Julia said, and he thought he detected genuine warmth in her voice now. Kyle mounted his horse, tipping his hat to her. Welcome to Montana territory, Mrs. Owens. I hope your homestead thrives. He turned his horse and rode away, but the melody stayed with him all the way home, humming in his mind like a half-remembered prayer. When he reached the Broken M, his foreman, Tom Bradley, was waiting by the barn with a report about a section of fence that needed repair. Kyle barely heard him, his thoughts still on the woman with the haunting voice and determined eyes. Over the next week, Kyle found excuses to ride past Julia's property. He told himself he was just being neighborly, checking to make sure she was managing all right, but the truth was he wanted to hear her sing again. Each time he passed, he heard that melody drifting across the prairie, and each time it pulled at something deep inside him he had thought long dead. On the 8th day, he saw smoke rising from Julia's chimney in an odd, thick column that did not look right. Without thinking, he spurred his horse into a gallop toward her cabin. As he drew closer, he could hear coughing and saw Julia stumble out of her front door, her face streaked with soot, waving smoke away from her face. Kyle was off his horse before it fully stopped, rushing to her side. Are you all right? What happened? Julia coughed again, her eyes watering. The chimney, she gasped. Something is blocking it. Bird's nest, maybe. The cabin filled with smoke so fast. Kyle looked into the open doorway and could see the haze still lingering inside. Do you have a ladder? Behind the cabin, Julia managed, her breathing starting to ease. Kyle found the ladder and propped it against the side of the cabin, climbing up to inspect the chimney. Sure enough, a large accumulation of twigs and debris had created a blockage. He pulled out his knife and carefully dislodged the mess, sending it tumbling to the ground. Try lighting a small fire now, he called down. Julia disappeared inside, and a few minutes later, clean smoke began rising properly from the chimney. Kyle climbed down and found her standing in the doorway, her face still smudged with soot but smiling with relief. Thank you, she said earnestly. I do not know what I would have done. I suppose I should have checked the chimney before winter, but I have been so focused on other repairs. It is easy to overlook, Kyle said, trying to ignore how the sight of her smile made his pulse quicken. Would you mind if I looked around, made sure everything else is in order? A chimney fire is no joke, especially with winter coming. Julia hesitated for only a moment before nodding. I would appreciate that, actually. I know farming, but cabin maintenance is newer to me. Kyle spent the next hour inspecting her cabin, checking the roof for weak spots, examining the window frames for gaps that would let in winter wind, and testing the stability of her small porch. Julia followed him around, asking questions and taking mental notes, and Kyle found himself enjoying her company more than he had enjoyed anything in years. She was intelligent and curious, not afraid to admit what she did not know, and when she laughed at his story about his first winter alone when he nearly froze because he forgot to stack enough wood, the sound was like music. "You should have a good supply of firewood by October," Kyle said as they stood looking at her modest woodpile. "That is not nearly enough. Do you have an axe?" "I do, but I admit I am not very skilled with it yet," Julia confessed. "I have been cutting what I can, but it is slow going." Kyle made a decision that was probably foolish but felt absolutely right. "I will send a couple of my men over tomorrow with a wagon. We will get you properly stocked. No arguments," he added when she opened her mouth to protest. "Out here, neighbors help each other. Come winter, that is all we have." Julia looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her pride warring with practicality. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer. I will find a way to repay you." "Just stay safe and warm this winter," Kyle said. "That is payment enough." As he rode home that evening, Kyle realized he was humming Julia's melody. And for the first time in 10 years, his ranch house did not feel like enough. It felt empty. True to his word, Kyle sent two of his most reliable hands, Jack and Pete, to Julia's homestead the next morning with a wagon full of split wood. He did not go himself, telling himself it was because he had ranch business to attend to, but the truth was he needed to get his feelings under control. He barely knew Julia Owens, and the intensity of his attraction to her was unsettling. He had convinced himself years ago that he was meant to live alone, that he was too set in his ways and too focused on building his ranch to make room for a wife. But Julia's voice and smile had awakened something in him that refused to be ignored. Jack and Pete returned that afternoon with an unexpected message. Julia had invited Kyle to Sunday dinner as thanks for the firewood. It was still 3 days away, and Kyle spent those 3 days in a state of nervous anticipation he had not felt since he was a young man courting his first sweetheart back in Missouri. He found himself taking extra care with his appearance on Sunday morning, trimming his beard more carefully than usual and putting on his best shirt, the dark green one his mother had made him before she died. The ride to Julia's homestead felt both too long and too short. When he arrived, Julia greeted him at the door wearing a dress he had not seen before, a soft yellow that brought out the warmth in her brown eyes. Her dark hair was pinned up in a simple but elegant style, and she smelled faintly of bread and lavender. "Mr. Mercer, welcome," she said, stepping back to let him inside. "Kyle, please," he said, removing his hat. "Mr. Mercer makes me feel like my father." Julia smiled at that. "Then you must call me Julia. Come in, dinner is almost ready." Her cabin was small but surprisingly cozy. She had made curtains for the windows, bright fabric that cheerfully defied the rough log walls, and a colorful quilt was draped over the back of her single chair. A simple table was set for two with mismatched plates and cups, but she had put wildflowers in a jar as a centerpiece, and the effort touched Kyle more than he could say. The meal was simple but delicious. Roasted chicken, potatoes, carrots from what must have been a quickly established garden, and fresh bread that melted in his mouth. They talked easily, Julia telling him about her life in Ohio, her brief marriage to a man who had been kind but restless, always chasing the next opportunity, and her decision to stake her own claim after his death rather than return to her family. "They wanted me to come home," Julia said, cutting into her chicken with more force than necessary. "My father said a woman alone could not make it on a homestead, that I should remarry or resign myself to being a burden on them. But I was not ready to marry again, not just for security, and I refuse to be seen as a burden. I earned this opportunity." Kyle heard the passion in her voice and understood it. "My father always said the measure of a person is not what they are given but what they build with their own hands." "You have nothing to prove to anyone, Julia, but I think you are going to succeed spectacularly anyway." She looked up at him, her eyes bright with emotion. "That means more than you know, coming from someone who has built something lasting here." They talked until the sun began to set, conversation flowing from topic to topic with ease Kyle had never experienced before. Julia told him about her dream of expanding her garden next spring, maybe even getting a few chickens and a milk cow. Kyle found himself offering advice and assistance without hesitation, already planning how he could help her realize those dreams. When it was time to leave, Kyle stood on her porch, reluctant to go. "Thank you for dinner, Julia. It was the finest meal I have had in longer than I can remember." "Thank you for the firewood and for checking my cabin," Julia replied, "and for the company. It gets lonely out here sometimes." "I know what you mean," Kyle said softly. On impulse, he added, "Would you like to come to my ranch next Sunday? I am not much of a cook, but I can manage a decent meal and I could show you around. It might be good for you to know where everything is in case of emergency." Julia's smile widened. "I would like that very much." Kyle rode home with his heart lighter than it had been in years, and he spent the week preparing for Julia's visit, like a man half his age preparing for his first dance. He cleaned his house more thoroughly than it had been cleaned since his mother died, asked his cook to teach him to make a proper roast, and even put fresh flowers from the prairie in a jar on his table, copying Julia's gesture, because it had made her cabin feel like a home. When Sunday came, Kyle rode to Julia's homestead to escort her to his ranch. She was waiting outside, wearing a practical riding skirt and looking excited. "I walked the distance once," she confessed as they started the ride together. "But I have to admit, 5 miles is longer than it seems when you are alone." "You should have asked for a horse," Kyle said. "I have several that need exercising." Julia shook her head. "I could not ask for more than you have already given." "It is not charity, it is practicality," Kyle insisted. "If you are going to live out here, you need reliable transportation. What if there was an emergency?" They argued about it good-naturedly all the way to the Broken M, and Kyle realized he was enjoying even the argument. The way Julia's eyes flashed when she was making a point, the determined set of her jaw. When they arrived at his ranch, Julia's eyes widened at the sight of the large barn, the extensive corrals, and the sturdy ranch house that Kyle's father had built to last. "This is impressive," Julia said as Kyle helped her dismount. "You should be proud." "My father built most of it," Kyle said, but he could not help the pride that swelled in his chest. "I have just been trying to maintain his vision." He showed her around the ranch, introducing her to his hands and explaining how the operation worked. Julia asked intelligent questions and seemed genuinely interested, and Kyle found himself sharing details he had never bothered to explain to anyone else. When they finally went inside for dinner, Kyle's nervousness returned, but the meal turned out well, and Julia praised his efforts sincerely. After dinner, they sat on Kyle's porch, watching the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Julia started humming that melody again, the one that had first drawn Kyle to her, and without thinking, he began to hum along, finding a harmony that complemented her tune. Julia stopped, turning to him in surprise. "You have a good voice." Kyle felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I have not sung in years. My mother used to make us sing hymns on Sundays, but after she died, there did not seem to be much point." "There is always a point to music," Julia said softly. "It reminds us we are alive." They sat in comfortable silence after that, and Kyle felt something shift between them, an understanding that went beyond words. When he rode Julia home that evening, guiding the gentle mare he had insisted she borrow, he knew he was falling in love with her. It terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. Over the following weeks, Kyle and Julia fell into a pattern of visiting each other every few days. Kyle helped Julia with the heavier work on her homestead, reinforcing her barn, helping her dig a better root cellar, and teaching her the tricks of frontier living he had learned through hard experience. In return, Julia cooked meals that made Kyle's house feel like a home again and filled his silent evenings with conversation and laughter. The first snow came in early November, earlier than usual, and Kyle rode to Julia's homestead in the morning to make sure she was prepared. He found her in her barn, struggling to repair a broken stall door, her hands red from the cold despite her gloves. "Let me help," Kyle said, and together they fixed the door properly, their shoulders brushing in the close confines of the small barn. When they finished, Julia turned to thank him and found herself mere inches from his face. Kyle saw his own feelings reflected in her eyes, and before he could overthink it, he leaned in and kissed her. Julia froze for a heartbeat, then kissed him back with a fervor that matched his own. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kyle rested his forehead against hers. "I have been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. "I was beginning to think you never would," Julia whispered, and Kyle laughed, the sound rusty from disuse but genuine. "I did not want to presume," Kyle said. "You came here for independence, not to be courted by your neighbor." Julia pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "Maybe I came here for both." They stood in the barn, holding each other while snow began to fall outside, and Kyle felt pieces of himself he had thought permanently broken begin to mend. They talked about what this meant, taking it slow, both of them cautious with hearts that had known loss. But the attraction between them was undeniable, and neither wanted to fight it anymore. As winter deepened, their relationship did too. Kyle found reasons to visit Julia almost daily, and she began spending more time at the Broken M, helping his cook with meals and bringing a warmth to the ranch house that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. Kyle's ranch hands approved of her, charmed by her willingness to work hard and her genuine interest in the ranch operations. One evening in late December, as they sat by Kyle's fire, Julia suddenly said, "Tell me about your parents." Kyle was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "My father was a good man," he finally said. "Strong, fair, hardworking. He built this ranch from nothing, and he taught me that land is not something you own, it is something you partner with. My mother was the heart of this place. She could make a house out of anything, and she never complained, not once, even when times were hard." "You miss them," Julia said softly. "Every day," Kyle admitted. "Especially around the holidays. My mother loved Christmas. She would make the house smell like cinnamon and pine, and she would insist we all sing carols, even though my father could not carry a tune to save his life." Julia squeezed his hand. "Sing with me now." "What?" "Sing with me," Julia repeated. "We will start a new tradition. Music to honor their memory." So they sang, Julia starting with a carol and Kyle joining in, his voice rough at first but growing stronger as the familiar words came back to him. They sang until they were laughing, until Kyle felt lighter than he had since his mother's death, and when Julia left that night, Kyle knew he could not imagine his life without her in it anymore. Christmas came, and Kyle gave Julia a beautiful bay mare, gentle and steady, perfect for a woman learning to manage a homestead alone. Julia gave him a quilt she had been secretly sewing for weeks, a pattern of interlocking rings in blues and greens that she said represented the land and sky of Montana. Kyle was moved nearly to tears by the gift, by the hours of work it represented and the thought behind it. "I love you," he said, the words escaping before he could stop them. "I know it is fast, and I know you value your independence, but I have to tell you, I love you, Julia." Julia's eyes filled with tears. "I love you too, Kyle. I did not come here looking for this, but I found something better than independence. I found a partner." They kissed under the mistletoe Kyle's mother had hung years ago and never taken down, and Kyle felt his mother's approval like a benediction. In January, Kyle asked Julia to marry him, presenting her with his mother's ring, a simple gold band with a small sapphire. "I want to be clear," he said as he knelt in her cabin, the fire crackling behind them. "I am not asking you to give up your homestead. We can work both properties. I am asking you to build a life with me as equals, as partners. Will you marry me, Julia?" Julia pulled him to his feet, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Kyle Mercer, I will marry you, but only if you promise to sing with me every day for the rest of our lives." "That is the easiest promise I have ever made," Kyle said, and kissed her again. They were married in February in Fort Benton, a simple ceremony attended by Kyle's ranch hands and a few townspeople who had gotten to know Julia over the winter. It was too cold for a large celebration, but they had a small party at the ranch house afterward, and someone brought a fiddle. Kyle danced with his bride, his heart so full he thought it might burst. And when Julia started singing that Irish melody that had first brought them together, everyone fell silent to listen. "Sing with her, boss," Tom called out, and Kyle did, finding his harmony to her melody, their voices blending together as naturally as if they had been singing together their whole lives. The winter passed in a haze of happiness. Julia moved into the ranch house, but insisted on maintaining her homestead as well, determined to prove up on her claim. Kyle supported her fully, helping her keep both properties running smoothly. They talked about the future, about expanding the ranch, about children, about growing old together on this land they both loved. Spring came early that year, melting the snow and bringing new life to the prairie. Julia discovered she was pregnant in April, and Kyle was overwhelmed with joy and terror in equal measure. He worried constantly about her health, about the dangers of childbirth on the frontier, but Julia remained calm and confident. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," she reminded him when he fretted. "I am strong, and I have the best husband in Montana Territory looking after me." Their son was born in December, a healthy boy with Kyle's dark hair and Julia's determined chin. They named him Matthew, after Kyle's father, and Kyle wept openly when he held his son for the first time, overwhelmed by the weight of his love and responsibility. Julia proved to be a natural mother, patient and loving but not coddling. She sang to Matthew constantly, that Irish melody becoming his lullaby, and Kyle would join in, their two voices creating a harmony that filled the ranch house with love. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and growth. Julia proved up on her homestead after 5 years, and they officially combined the two properties, creating one of the larger ranches in the area. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Margaret after Kyle's mother, and another son they named Thomas after Kyle's loyal foreman, who had become like family to them both. Kyle's ranch prospered under their joint management. Julia had a good head for business and convinced Kyle to diversify, adding horses to their cattle operation. She was right, as usual, and the horse breeding became a profitable sideline. More importantly, Julia made the Broken M a true home, a place where ranch hands wanted to work and neighbors wanted to visit. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Kyle took Julia up to the hill where he had first heard her singing, the place where his life had changed forever. Their children were with Tom and his wife for the evening, giving Kyle and Julia a rare night alone. "You remember the first time we met?" Kyle asked as they stood watching the sunset. "How could I forget?" Julia replied, leaning into his embrace. "I was so startled when you appeared." "I thought you might be a bandit or worse," Kyle laughed. "And I thought I was hearing angels." "Just a widow hanging laundry," Julia said with a smile. "No," Kyle said seriously, turning her to face him. "You were so much more than that. You were my second chance, Julia. You brought music back into my life. You gave me a family. You made me believe in happiness again." Julia reached up to touch his face. "You gave me a home, Kyle. Not just a house or land, but a true home. You saw me as a partner when the world saw me as just a widow who did not know her place. You gave me love without asking me to give up myself." They stood there as the sky turned from gold to purple to deep blue, and Julia began to hum that familiar Irish melody. Kyle joined in, their voices blending in the harmony they had perfected over 10 years of marriage, the melody drifting across the prairie like a blessing. "Sing the words this time," Kyle said. "You never told me there were words." Julia smiled and began to sing in a clear, sweet voice. "Come away with me, love, to where the grass grows green, to where the mountains touch the sky and the valleys lie between. We will build our home together with our love to keep us warm, and we will sing our song forever through sunshine and through storm." Kyle felt tears on his cheeks and did not bother to wipe them away. "Your mother taught you that." "She did," Julia confirmed. "She said her grandmother sang it to her grandfather when they left Ireland for America. It is a song about partnership, about building something together." "It is perfect," Kyle said. "It is us." They rode home together under the stars, their horses walking side by side, and Kyle thought about the journey that had brought them here. He had been alone, convinced his life was complete, until he heard a woman humming while hanging laundry. That simple moment had changed everything, had led to this life full of love and purpose and music. As they reached the ranch house, they could hear their children inside, their voices raised in excited chatter as they convinced Tom and his wife to let them stay up late. Kyle and Julia paused on the porch, listening to the sounds of their family, their home. "Thank you," Kyle said softly. "For what?" Julia asked. "For singing that day," Kyle replied. "For not sending me away. For taking a chance on a lonely rancher who did not know what he was missing." Julia kissed him gently. "Thank you for listening, for hearing more than just a melody, for finding your harmony." They went inside together, welcomed by the chaos of children and the warmth of home, and the house filled with laughter and music, just as it had every day since Julia had become part of Kyle's life. The years continued to unfold with the kind of quiet happiness that many people search for but few find. Kyle and Julia's children grew strong and capable, each of them inheriting their parents' work ethic and their mother's musical ability. Matthew, the eldest, showed a natural aptitude for ranching and seemed destined to take over the Broken M one day. Margaret was more interested in the horses, spending hours in the barn and displaying a gift for training that impressed even the most experienced hands. Thomas, the youngest, was the dreamer, always asking questions about the world beyond Montana territory and talking about becoming a teacher. Kyle supported all of their dreams, remembering how his own father had encouraged him to find his own path. Julia insisted all 3 children receive a proper education, riding into Fort Benton twice a week with them for lessons with the school teacher, a stern but fair woman named Mrs. Henderson. When the children complained about the long ride or difficult lessons, Julia reminded them that education was a gift, one that would serve them no matter what path they chose. One spring morning when Matthew was 15, Margaret 12, and Thomas 10, Kyle woke to find Julia sitting on the porch in the pre-dawn light, wrapped in a shawl and humming that familiar melody. He joined her, bringing a cup of coffee for each of them. "Could not sleep?" he asked. Julia smiled, taking the coffee gratefully. "I was just thinking about how different my life is from what I imagined when I was a girl in Ohio. I thought I would marry a farmer, have children, and live a simple life. I never imagined Montana Territory or a ranch or you. Regrets?" Kyle asked, though he was fairly certain he knew the answer. "Not a single one," Julia said firmly. "This life has been better than anything I could have imagined. Hard sometimes, yes, but good. So good." Kyle put his arm around her, and they sat together watching the sun rise over the prairie, painting the grass gold and making the distant mountains glow. These were the moments Kyle treasured most, the quiet times with Julia when they did not need words to communicate, when their harmony was complete. Later that day, a rider came from town with news that would ripple through their peaceful life. Montana had finally achieved statehood, no longer a territory but a full member of the Union. Fort Benton was planning a celebration and everyone was invited. The children were excited about the prospect of a party, but Kyle noticed Julia seemed pensive. "What is it?" he asked that evening after the children were in bed. "I was just thinking about how much has changed," Julia said. "When I filed my homestead claim, this was still wild territory. Now it is a state. Our children will grow up in a different world than we did." "Is that bad?" Kyle asked. "No," Julia said slowly. "Just different. I suppose every generation says that, watching the world change around them." "Some things do not change," Kyle pointed out. "The land is still here. The sky is still big. People still need to work hard and treat each other with respect. And love is still love, no matter what else changes." Julia smiled and kissed him. "When did you become such a philosopher?" "I married a wise woman," Kyle replied. "It rubbed off. The statehood celebration was indeed a grand affair. It seemed like everyone within 50 miles came to Fort Benton for the festivities. There were speeches and fireworks, dancing and music, and more food than Kyle had seen in one place since he was a boy. Kyle and Julia danced together while their children ran wild with the other youngsters, and Kyle was struck by how Julia still took his breath away after all these years. Her face flushed with laughter, and her eyes bright with joy. As evening fell and the dancing continued, someone called for Julia to sing. She protested at first, but the crowd insisted, and finally she agreed. She sang that Irish melody, the one that had brought her and Kyle together, and the crowd fell silent to listen. When she finished, there was not a dry eye in the crowd, and Kyle felt his heart swell with pride and love. On the way home, Matthew rode alongside Kyle's wagon. "Pa, Mrs. Henderson said something interesting at the celebration." "What is that, son?" Kyle asked. "She said that Montana becoming a state means new opportunities, that the territory days are ending and the modern age is beginning. Do you think that is true?" Kyle considered the question carefully. "I think change is always happening, whether we call it territory or state. But the important things remain. Hard work still matters. Integrity still matters. Family still matters. Do not get so caught up in what is new that you forget what is valuable." Matthew nodded thoughtfully, and Kyle hoped his words had resonated. Raising children was harder than running a ranch in many ways, all the high stakes and none of the control. But he and Julia did their best to instill good values while allowing their children to become their own people. That summer brought a drought, the worst Kyle had seen in his 20-plus years in Montana. The creek that fed both their land and several neighbors' properties shrank to a trickle, and the grass turned brown and brittle. Kyle worked alongside his hands from dawn to dusk, moving cattle to better grazing, rationing water, and praying for rain that did not come. Julia proved her worth during that difficult time, organizing the household to use water efficiently and rallying the neighboring women to share resources. She also kept morale up with her cooking and her music, refusing to let the drought defeat their spirits even when circumstances looked grim. One particularly hot evening, as Kyle sat exhausted on the porch, Julia brought him water and sat beside him. "We will get through this," she said firmly. "We have weathered hard times before." "I know," Kyle said. "I just worry. About the cattle, about the ranch, about providing for you and the children." "You have always provided for us," Julia said, taking his hand. "Not just with money or food, but with love and stability and a good example. Whatever happens with the ranch, we have each other. That is what matters most." Kyle squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her faith in him. "How did I get so lucky? You listened to a woman humming," Julia replied with a smile. "And you were not too proud to admit you needed harmony in your life." The rains finally came in August, heavy downpours that turned the prairie green again and refilled the creek to overflowing. Kyle stood in the rain, face turned to the sky, and laughed with relief. They had lost some cattle, but not as many as he had feared, and the ranch would survive. More importantly, the experience had taught him once again that his greatest resource was not the land or the cattle, but the woman who stood beside him through every storm. As Matthew approached his 16th birthday, he began talking seriously about his future on the ranch. Kyle was pleased but wanted to make sure Matthew was choosing ranching because he loved it, not out of obligation. One day, Kyle took his son on a ride to the hill where he had first heard Julia singing, the place that held such significance in Kyle's personal history. "You know why I brought you here?" Kyle asked as they looked out over the land. "Not really, Pa," Matthew admitted. "This is where I first heard your mother," Kyle explained. "I was riding the property line, convinced I was happy alone when I heard her singing. In that moment, everything changed. I realized I had been living only half a life." Matthew listened intently as Kyle continued. "The reason I am telling you this is because I want you to understand that the most important choices in life are not about duty or expectation. They are about what makes you come alive, what gives your life meaning. If ranching does that for you, then I am honored to have you as my partner and eventual successor. But if your heart pulls you elsewhere, you have my blessing to follow it." "I love the ranch, Pa," Matthew said earnestly. "I love the work, the land, the cattle. I cannot imagine doing anything else." Kyle felt relief and pride wash over him. "Then we will start training you properly, not just as a hand, but as a manager and eventual owner. It is a big responsibility." "I know," Matthew said, "but I have learned from the best." They rode back together, and Kyle felt the satisfaction of knowing his legacy would continue, that the land his father had claimed and he had built upon would pass to another generation who would value and care for it. Margaret, meanwhile, was developing into a formidable horsewoman. At 13, she could ride anything on four legs and had a gift for gentling even the most skittish animals. Kyle and Julia discussed sending her to apprentice with a renowned horse trainer in Helena, but Margaret insisted she would rather learn on the ranch. "Everything I need to know, I can learn here," she argued at the dinner table one evening. "Why would I go somewhere else when I have the best teachers right here?" Julia met Kyle's eyes across the table, and he could see she was as touched as he was. Their children valued family and home, and there was no greater compliment to their parenting than that. Thomas remained the outlier, more interested in books than branding, more fascinated by history and ideas than by the daily operations of the ranch. Kyle sometimes worried that Thomas felt like he did not fit, but Julia assured him that every family needed diversity, that Thomas's different perspective enriched them all. One winter evening, when Thomas was 12, Kyle found the boy in the barn reading by lantern light instead of doing his chores. Instead of scolding him, Kyle sat down beside him. "What are you reading?" Thomas showed him the book, A History of the American West. "It is fascinating, Pa. Did you know that the Homestead Act brought over 4 million people west? And that Montana had indigenous peoples living here for thousands of years before settlers came?" Kyle had known some of this, but Thomas's enthusiasm was infectious. "What interests you most about it?" "The stories," Thomas said, his eyes bright. "Everyone has a story about why they came west, what they hope to find. Like Ma coming here alone to start over. Those stories matter. They should be preserved." Kyle understood then what his youngest son needed. "Have you thought about writing these stories down, talking to people about their experiences?" Thomas looked surprised. "I could do that." "Why not?" Kyle said. "The world needs storytellers as much as it needs ranchers, maybe more. How else will future generations know where they came from?" From that day forward, Thomas began interviewing people, writing down their stories in careful script. He started with Julia, recording her tale of leaving Ohio and filing a homestead claim, then moved on to the ranch hands and neighbors. Kyle was moved when Thomas asked to interview him, treating his father's story with the same seriousness he gave everyone else. The years moved forward with the steady rhythm of ranch life. Kyle and Julia aged gracefully, their love deepening with each passing season. They still sang together most evenings, their voices perhaps not as strong as they once were, but their harmony as perfect as ever. The children grew into capable adults, each following their own path while remaining connected to the family and the land. Matthew took over more and more of the ranch operations, proving himself to be a skilled manager with a good eye for livestock and a fair hand with the workers. At 22, he married a sensible young woman named Sarah from Fort Benton, and they began building their own house on the property, starting the cycle anew. Margaret became known throughout Montana as one of the finest horse trainers around, her reputation bringing buyers from as far away as Wyoming and Idaho. She remained unmarried, declaring that she had not yet met a man who interested her as much as horses did, which made Julia laugh and Kyle worry unnecessarily. Thomas eventually went east to college, the first in the family to do so, studying history and journalism. It was hard for Kyle to let him go, but Julia reminded him that love meant supporting their children's dreams, not clinging to them. Thomas wrote home regularly, and his letters were full of excitement about his studies and his plans to write a comprehensive history of Montana homesteaders. On Kyle and Julia's 25th wedding anniversary, their children organized a surprise celebration, inviting friends and neighbors from all over the region. The ranch house was full of people, music, and laughter, and Kyle looked around at what he and Julia had built together with a sense of deep contentment. When someone called for speeches, Matthew stood up first. "My parents taught me that success is not measured in acres or cattle, but in relationships and integrity. They showed me what partnership looks like, how two people can work together as equals while maintaining their individual strengths. They gave me a legacy I am proud to continue." Margaret spoke next, tears in her eyes. "My mother taught me that a woman can do anything she sets her mind to, and my father taught me that a real man supports and encourages the women in his life." They broke every stereotype about what marriage and partnership had to be, and they did it with grace and love. Finally, Thomas stood, and Kyle noticed he was holding papers. "I have been writing everyone's stories for years now, but I never wrote my parents' story. I would like to share it now." Thomas read a beautiful account of how Kyle and Julia met, how a rancher heard a woman humming while hanging laundry and found his harmony. He described their courtship, their marriage, and their years of partnership with such eloquence that there was not a dry eye in the room. When Thomas finished, Kyle stood and pulled Julia to her feet. "I cannot match my son's eloquence," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But I can say this. 25 years ago, I was a lonely man who had forgotten how to sing. Julia taught me to find my voice again, and together we have created a symphony. She has been my partner, my best friend, my greatest blessing. I love you, Julia, more today than even yesterday." Julia was crying openly now. "And I love you, Kyle. You gave me a home when I needed one, not just a place but a true home. You respected my independence while offering your support. You showed me that love does not diminish us, it completes us." They kissed to thunderous applause, and then someone struck up a fiddle. Kyle and Julia danced together, moving easily despite their 50-plus years, and Kyle was transported back to their wedding day, to all the days and nights they had shared since then. The melody that had brought them together still played in his heart, as fresh and beautiful as the first time he had heard it. As the celebration continued into the night, Kyle and Julia slipped away to their favorite spot, the hill where it had all begun. They stood together watching the stars, and Julia began to hum that Irish melody. "You remember being afraid?" Julia asked softly. "When we first met, when feelings started developing." "Terrified," Kyle admitted. "I thought I was too old, too set in my ways, too damaged from loss. I almost talked myself out of pursuing you a dozen times." "I am glad you did not," Julia said. "I was afraid too, afraid of losing my independence, of being hurt again, of failing at my homestead. But you showed me that the right partnership does not limit you, it expands you." They stood in comfortable silence for a while before Kyle said, "Do you remember what you told me to promise on the day I proposed? To sing with you every day for the rest of our lives," Julia recalled. "I have kept that promise," Kyle said, "and I will keep it until my last breath. You are my harmony, Julia. Everything beautiful in my life comes back to you." Julia turned in his arms, and even in the starlight, Kyle could see the love shining in her eyes. "And you are my home, Kyle. You always have been." They sang together then, their voices carrying across the prairie, a testament to 25 years of love and partnership and harmony. The melody that had brought them together sustained them still, a promise kept, a life well lived, a love that had transformed them both. The years continued to pass with the grace of a life well lived. Kyle and Julia remained active in managing the ranch well into their 60s, though they gradually handed over more responsibility to Matthew and Sarah. They became grandparents, delighting in Matthew and Sarah's children with the special joy that comes from loving without the daily responsibility of parenting. Margaret eventually met a veterinarian who came to Fort Benton to set up practice. He was as passionate about horses as she was, and they bonded over discussions of animal husbandry and training techniques. Kyle and Julia were amused to watch their independent daughter fall in love, despite her protestations that she was happy alone. She married at 31, and at the wedding she told Julia, "I finally understand what you and Pa have. I was not going to settle for anything less." Thomas completed his book on Montana homesteaders, and it was published to critical acclaim. He dedicated it to Kyle and Julia, writing in the foreword, "To my parents, who showed me that the greatest adventures are the ones we take with someone we love, and that true success is measured not in what we acquire but in what we build together." Kyle cried when he read that dedication, and Julia teased him gently about becoming sentimental in his old age. But she was crying too, proud of all three of their children and grateful for the life they had built together. On their 40th wedding anniversary, Kyle and Julia took a trip, just the two of them, riding out to Julia's original homestead. The cabin still stood, though it was used now mainly for storage and as an occasional shelter for hands working the far sections of the combined property. They went inside, and Julia ran her hand over the rough wooden table where they had shared that first meal together. "You remember how nervous I was?" Julia asked, smiling at the memory. "I wanted so badly to impress you, to show you I was not just some foolish widow in over her head." "You impressed me from the first moment," Kyle said honestly. "Not because of your cooking or your homesteading skills, though both were admirable. You impressed me because you were brave enough to dream big and strong enough to chase that dream. You still do." They walked outside to where the laundry line had once hung, long since removed. "This is where you were standing when I first saw you," Kyle said. "Hanging laundry and humming that melody. I thought I was hearing things, that the loneliness had finally driven me mad." Julia laughed. "And I thought you were a bandit come to rob or murder me. We have come a long way from those first moments." "We have," Kyle agreed, "and I would not change a single step of the journey." They rode back to the main ranch house as the sun began to set, and Kyle felt a deep peace settle over him. He had lived a good life, a life full of purpose and love. He had built something lasting, not just in terms of property and cattle, but in relationships and family. His legacy would continue long after he was gone, not because of what he had owned, but because of how he had loved. That evening, as had become their custom over 40 years, Kyle and Julia sat on their porch and sang together. Their voices were weathered now, marked by time and use, but their harmony was as perfect as ever. The melody that had brought them together remained constant, a through line in their lives that connected past to present to future. Matthew and Sarah came by with the grandchildren, and Margaret and her husband stopped in as well. Thomas was visiting from back east where he taught at a university, and the house was full of family and noise and love. They gathered on the porch to watch the sunset, 3 generations together, and Kyle looked around at what he and Julia had created with a sense of deep satisfaction. "Pa, will you tell us the story again?" asked Kyle's oldest grandchild, a precocious girl of 8 named Emily. "About how you met Grandma." Kyle looked at Julia, and she nodded with a smile. So Kyle told the story once more, about hearing a melody on the prairie wind, about a woman humming while hanging laundry, about finding his harmony when he had forgotten he had a voice. The children listened with rapt attention, even though they had heard the story dozens of times before, because it never got old. When Kyle finished, Emily said, "That is the most romantic story ever, Grandpa. I want to find someone who hears me singing one day." "I hope you do, sweetheart," Kyle said. "But remember, the singing is not the important part. The important part is finding someone who appreciates your melody and adds their harmony to it, someone who makes your song better just by being part of it." As the evening drew to a close and the family prepared to leave, Thomas pulled Kyle aside. "Pa, I am thinking of writing another book. This one would be just about you and Ma, a love story set against the backdrop of frontier Montana. Would that be all right?" Kyle was moved. "I think your mother would love that, but you make sure to tell the truth, son. Not just the romantic parts, but the hard work and the difficult times too. Real love is not just poetry and sunset, it is choosing each other every day, even when it is hard." "I will, Pa," Thomas promised. "That is what makes your story so powerful. You two worked at your relationship, you built it intentionally, and it lasted because you both invested in it fully." After everyone left, Kyle and Julia sat alone on the porch once more. The stars were coming out, bright and clear in the big Montana sky, and a breeze carried the scent of prairie grass and distant pine. "You ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had not filed that homestead claim?" Kyle asked. If you had stayed in Ohio or gone somewhere else? Julia considered the question seriously. Sometimes, she admitted, but I cannot imagine it would have been better. This life with you has exceeded every dream I had. I came west looking for land and independence, and I found so much more. I found purpose and partnership and a love that sustained me through everything. I feel the same, Kyle said. I thought my life was complete before you came along. I thought I had accepted being alone, that I had made peace with it. But I was just existing, not living. You taught me the difference. They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the night deepen around them. After a while, Julia began to hum that familiar melody, and Kyle joined in, their voices blending in the harmony they had perfected over 40 years of marriage. The melody drifted across the prairie, a song of love and partnership, of two lives intertwined so completely that it was impossible to say where one ended and the other began. As the years advanced, Kyle and Julia gradually stepped back from the daily operations of the ranch entirely, trusting Matthew and Sarah to carry on the legacy. They spent their days doing the things they loved, riding the property together, tending Julia's garden, and spending time with grandchildren. They remained healthy and active well into their 70s, a testament to clean living and strong constitutions. On their 50th wedding anniversary, the family organized an even larger celebration than the one for their 25th. It seemed like everyone in Montana had a story about Kyle and Julia, about their kindness, their integrity, their example of what a true partnership looked like. The celebration lasted 2 days, with people camping on the ranch property, sharing meals and stories and music. On the second evening, as the party was winding down, Kyle stood to make a speech. At 76 years old, he was still tall and strong, his hair white but his eyes as sharp as ever. Julia sat beside him, beautiful in a new dress Margaret had made for her hair silver but her smile unchanged. 50 years ago, Kyle began, his voice carrying in the quiet evening air, I married the woman who saved my life. Not from physical danger, though she has patched me up plenty of times over the years. She saved me from a life half lived, from loneliness I did not even realize was killing me. She taught me to sing again, to laugh again, to hope again. Everything good in my life flows from that first moment when I heard her humming while hanging laundry and had the courage to introduce myself. He turned to Julia, taking her hands in his. You have been my partner in every sense of the word. You worked beside me, struggled with me, celebrated with me, and built this incredible legacy with me. You gave me 3 amazing children and more grandchildren than I can keep track of. You filled my house with music and my life with purpose. I love you more today than I did 50 years ago, which I would not have thought possible on our wedding day. Thank you for saying yes, for taking a chance on a lonely rancher, for staying through every storm. You are my harmony, Julia, and I am the luckiest man who ever lived. Julia was crying, and so was most of the assembled crowd. She stood and kissed Kyle, not caring who was watching, and the crowd erupted in applause. Then Julia spoke, her voice still strong and clear. Kyle Mercer, you gave me a home when I needed one most. Not just a house or land, but a true home. You respected my independence while offering your partnership. You never tried to diminish me or limit me. Instead, you encouraged me to be everything I could be. You have been my rock, my companion, my truest friend, and the love of my life. These 50 years have been the greatest adventure, and I would not change a single moment. They danced that night, as they had danced at their wedding 50 years before, their movements perhaps slower but their connection as strong as ever. Their children and grandchildren watched with misty eyes, understanding they were witnessing something rare and precious, a love that had lasted, grown, and deepened across 5 decades. Thomas completed his book about Kyle and Julia's love story, and it became his most successful work. He sent them the first copy, and they read it together over the course of a week, reliving their life through their son's eloquent prose. Kyle was embarrassed by how romantic Thomas made him seem, but Julia assured him it was all true. "You are a romantic, Kyle Mercer," she insisted. "You always have been. You just hide it behind practicality and ranch work." The book's success brought unexpected attention, with a reporter from back east coming to interview them about frontier love and partnership. Kyle and Julia were bemused by the interest but graciously answered questions, hoping their story might encourage others to build the kind of partnership they had found. "What is your secret?" the reporter asked. "How have you stayed in love for over 50 years?" Kyle and Julia looked at each other, communicating silently as they often did, and then Kyle answered. "There is no secret, not really. We chose each other every day. We worked at our relationship the way we worked at building this ranch. We communicated, we compromised, we supported each other's dreams. We never took each other for granted, and we never stopped singing together." "Singing?" the reporter asked, confused. Julia smiled. "Music brings people together. It creates harmony from individual notes. Our relationship has been like that. Two distinct people creating something beautiful together. Kyle heard me singing one day, and he found his harmony. We have been singing together ever since." The reporter asked them to demonstrate, and Kyle and Julia sang that Irish melody together, their voices weathered but their harmony perfect. The reporter wrote about it with such poetry that the article was syndicated across the country, and Kyle and Julia received letters from people they had never met, thanking them for exemplifying what marriage could be. As Kyle approached his 80th birthday, he began to slow down despite his best efforts to remain active. He had always been so strong, so capable, and it frustrated him when his body started to betray him with aches and limitations. Julia, now 77 herself, was patient with his frustration, reminding him that aging was a privilege denied to many. "We have had a good run," she would say, "and we are not done yet." Kyle's 80th birthday was celebrated with characteristic warmth and chaos, the ranch house full of family and friends. Kyle looked around at the celebration and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. He had lived longer than his father, longer than most men of his generation, and he had lived well. He had loved and been loved. What more could a man ask? That night, after everyone had gone home, Kyle and Julia walked slowly to their favorite hill, the place where Kyle had first heard Julia singing. They moved slower now, both of them leaning on walking sticks, but they made it to the top and stood looking out over the land they had shared for more than 5 decades. "You have any regrets?" Julia asked softly. Kyle thought about it seriously. "Only that I did not hear you singing sooner," he finally said. "I would have liked even more years with you." Julia leaned into him, and he put his arm around her shoulders. "We have had enough years to build something extraordinary. Look at what we created together, Kyle. 3 wonderful children, grandchildren who know they are loved, a ranch that will continue for generations, and a love story that people find inspiring. That is more than most people get." "It is more than I deserve," Kyle said. "It is exactly what you deserve," Julia corrected. "You are a good man, Kyle Mercer. You have lived with integrity and kindness. You have loved generously and worked diligently. You deserve every good thing." They stood together as the sun set, and Julia began to hum that melody one more time. Kyle joined in, their voices thin with age but their harmony as perfect as the first time they had sung together. The melody drifted across the prairie, a song of love and partnership, of a life well lived and a promise kept. Kyle lived 2 more years, dying peacefully in his sleep at 82 with Julia beside him, his hand in hers. He died knowing he was loved, surrounded by family in the house he had built and the land he had tended. At his funeral, Julia sang that Irish melody one last time, her voice breaking with grief but carrying through to the end. There was not a dry eye among the hundreds of people who came to pay their respects. Julia lived another 5 years after Kyle's death, remaining on the ranch and staying active despite her grief. She spent her days with her children and grandchildren, teaching them her songs and her wisdom, making sure Kyle's legacy lived on not just in the land but in the values he had embodied. On what would have been their 57th wedding anniversary, Julia went out to the hill where she had first met Kyle. She stood there alone, looking out over the prairie, and began to hum that familiar melody. For a moment, she could swear she heard Kyle's voice joining hers in harmony, and she smiled through her tears. Julia passed away that night, peacefully in her sleep, and her children took comfort in believing that she and Kyle were together again, their harmony restored. At her funeral, all 3 children stood together and sang that Irish melody, their voices blending in honor of their parents' love. Thomas gave the eulogy, speaking about a woman who had been brave enough to claim a homestead alone, strong enough to build a life on the frontier, and wise enough to recognize true love when it found her. He spoke about a partnership that had transformed not just 2 lives but everyone who witnessed it. "My parents taught me that love is not just a feeling, it is a choice you make every day," Thomas said. They chose each other, supported each other, and built something beautiful together. Their harmony did not happen by accident. It was the result of 2 people committed to creating something greater than themselves. That is their legacy, and it will live on in all of us. Kyle and Julia were buried side by side on the ranch, on that hill where Kyle had first heard Julia singing, under a sky as big and blue as the day they met. Their headstone was simple, bearing their names and dates, but Matthew added one line at the bottom. They found their harmony. The ranch continued to thrive under Matthew's management, and then under his sons, and then his. The story of how Kyle heard Julia humming while hanging laundry and found his harmony became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. Thomas's book ensured the story reached beyond the family, inspiring readers with its tale of love found in an unlikely place, of 2 people who took a chance on each other and built something lasting. Years later, one of Kyle and Julia's great-granddaughters stood in that same spot on the hill, looking out over the ranch that had been in the family for generations. She was about to get married, and she had come here to feel close to her great-grandparents, to draw strength from their example. As she stood there, she began to hum that Irish melody Julia had taught her, the one that had been passed down through 4 generations now. And as she hummed, she understood something her great-grandfather had understood over a century before. That sometimes the most important moments in life are the quiet ones, the moments when we hear a melody and choose to add our harmony to it. She thought about the man she was about to marry, about the partnership they would build together, and she smiled. She would tell her children one day about Kyle and Julia, about a rancher who heard a woman humming while hanging laundry and found his harmony. She would teach them the melody and the lesson it carried. That love is not just found, it is built, one note at a time, until 2 separate voices become a harmony that echoes across generations. The wind blew across the prairie, carrying the scent of grass and wildflowers, and the young woman could swear she heard 2 voices singing together. A man and a woman in perfect harmony, their song eternal as the land they had loved. She added her voice to theirs, and the melody continued, a promise kept, a legacy honored, a love that would never die as long as someone remembered to sing.